My name is Troy Storfjell. My father is Johan Björnar Storfjell, and his parents were Arthur Storfjell and Margit Storfjell, born Margit Pedersen Björnhaug. My father and my grandfather are from Ballak or Ballangen in Norrlanda or Nordland in Norway, and my grandmother Margit was from Saljavaddi or Seljeskogen in Salangen in Troms on the Norwegian side. My mother is Judith Lloyd Storfjell, born Judith Lloyd from Portland, Oregon, and and her parents were Chester Stanley Lloyd and Iris Pearl Lloyd, and Chester Stanley was born in Tumwater, Washington, and Iris Pearl was born in Iron Mountain, Michigan. So yeah.
Okay, tell me a little bit about your family upbringing and how all of the culture kind of melded in with you growing up. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, it's obviously since my mother's American and my father is Sámi from the Norwegian side, I've got mixed background. My mother actually went over to spend a year of college in Norway, which is where she met my father, and he followed her back, and they went to college out in Walla Walla, where I was born, just before they graduated, and then we moved to Norway right after that. And we were back and forth, Norway and the U.S. for a few years, and then we went out to the Middle East, lived in Beirut, Lebanon for some years, and back to Norway, and finally to Michigan in the U.S. So my early childhood was a lot of moving around and growing up bilingual with Norwegian and English. And then later childhood was in the U.S., and the Norwegian sort of faded to the background, the language. And I didn't have Sámi. My grandparents spoke Sámi, but they didn't teach it to my father. So when I was 10, I went to live with my grandparents, but they just retired and they moved down south to Tønsberg. So I spent some time in Tønsberg in Norway when I was 10, and that sort of revived my Norwegian. We'd come over when I was 7 to sort of end up in the U.S. And so went back and spent some time living with my grandparents who didn't speak any English, so it was like I had to revive the language. And then from that point on, we went over pretty frequently. We're always visiting relatives every year. Sometimes we'd skip a year, but and sometimes we'd go two times a year. And then when I got to college, I did a year over in Austria and went up to Norway a lot, visiting relatives, and ended up finally going up and spending time in. I'd go and work over in the summers too, because as a Norwegian citizen, I could make a lot more money working in Norway. Than minimum wage in Norway was a lot higher in the 80s than it was in the U.S. So. I was there back and forth a lot, and it was just this until I really moved over there as a young adult again up to Tromsø to go to the university there back in the early 90s. So in my whole childhood was, I really thought of myself as sort of having two versions of myself, who I was in the U.S. and who I was in Norway. And there'd always be a little lag when I'd move from one country to, if I go over for the summer to Norway and I'd come back, it'd be a few weeks of adjusting to being back in the U.S. and sort of the way I narrated it to myself was to say that I had a Norwegian personality and an American personality, and it took a little time to shift. It was. I think I'm grateful that I spent a lot of my early childhood in Norway before Norway got wealthy, back when the standard of living was higher in the U.S. than in Norway. And in Norway, everything was, if something broke, you repaired it. If you got holes in your jeans, you mended them. Holes in your socks, you darned them. Well, I didn't. I was too young, but they were always mended and darned, and things were handed down. And because sometime in the 80s that changed, and suddenly Norway had a much higher standard of living than the U.S. and much more prosperity. And I look at younger people in Norway now, and I'm like, I'm glad I didn't grow up with that. That I grew up without all that wealth that's just spread around so much now. Not that it's exciting to be poor, but it teaches you to value things, I think. So, I don't know. I thought I am. In terms of other values, I knew my family was Sámi. We knew that, but I didn't really know what that meant anything special to me. Living away from, I just thought there were some things that my family did that were different from what a lot of the other Norwegian families did. And it wasn't until I was at the University of Tromsø in the early 90s and meeting other Sami students, I'm like, those aren't just weird things that my family did. That's like Sami culture too. So that was a real big revelation to me, because like most Sami on the Norwegian side, when I lived in Norway, I lived in areas where the Sami were locally the minority. It's only sort of in inner Finnmark and in Tysfjord where the Sami are the local majority. And it's just the south side of Tysfjord, so not even all of Tysfjord. And so for me and for a lot of people that I met, going to university was kind of an eye-opening experience for a lot of young Sami people, because you discover that there's a whole ethnic group out there with very similar backgrounds. So that made a big that was a big revelation. I got involved in the Sami student union there. Got involved in helping to co-found the Sami youth organization Davinora, which lasted about 10 years before it underwent some reorganization, and now it's I think it's Nordic. I'm not sure what it's called now, but it's a slightly different organization. So up until I'd been a student in Tromsø, I really sort of for me, the sort of cultural divide that in my life was between Norway and the U.S. But in Norway, I always recognized that my family were Northerners and had its own little peculiar version of being Northern Norwegians, Nordlending, that was not the same as everybody's. So, but that really then after starting to study there and getting involved with all the Sami organizations and Sami friends, I really started to realize, well, there's sort of white mainstream American culture in my family. There's certainly Norwegian culture, but that's through the prism of sort of Sami experience of Norwegian culture, and a lot of things. Like the fact that my father made a goahti, this turf hut behind our house in Lebanon when we lived there. I thought, well, that's just him being weird. And I was like, no, that's a common traditional Sami dwelling so it might be the only one that was ever built in Beirut. I don't know. But just little things like that. And there's also ways of being in nature that he emphasized, that we did a lot of, that it turned out that it wasn't just his personality. I just thought that was just my dad. It is his personality, but it was something that he also got from somewhere and shared with a lot of other people. So I ended up going to grad school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It was the area where I could do the graduate project that I wanted to do, which was to look at sort of representations of Sami in majority language Scandinavian literature. And that I took 10 years to do that process. It was so fun that I just didn't want to stop. And I always intended to go back. I was going to get my PhD and go back and work in Norway, and that never materialized. Never got a job offer. I applied, but there were limited positions, and they were usually in Oslo, which meant that people with a lot of experience from elsewhere were trying to get to Oslo, and a newcomer, or they just didn't know what to do with me and my weird concentration. So I've taught at a number of different places in the U.S., and I ended up marrying my wife, Kiana, who's from Appleton, Wisconsin, and having 2 boys growing up in the U.S. So when it finally came around about 10 years ago, I did get a job offer in Norway. I was too firmly embedded here to make the move. But I've been doing all the work, most of my scholarship is Sami related or Indigenous related, or using Sami perspectives to look at Norwegian or Swedish texts or films. So it's all been focused on that. And so in the last 10 years, I've really begun working in the larger field of Indigenous studies. And when I sort of realized that I chose to be here now, my goal of going back there didn't happen, and I made the choice to stay here. I wanted to do some work here that was meaningful to me. So I've been working. I helped, I led the process of creating a Native American and Indigenous Studies program at PLU. And I've been active then in the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association in the leadership of that. And so that's a way that I can do work that's related to my own background and interests that's meaningful here, in working with other Indigenous peoples and cultures and working with Indigenous students. Usually, of course, not Sámi students, although I've been fortunate. I've had 4 Sámi students at PLU as well who've come over from Norway, so in different times. And one of them's now a PhD student at the University of Washington right here. So that's sort of in terms of my biography and journey. I guess I should say I've tried to raise my kids as Sámi and as Norwegian citizens. It's difficult. They've only spent a year in Norway, up in Tromsø when I had sabbatical 10 years ago, and they enjoyed that experience. But it's a limited experience. It's a very different experience. Mine was already limited compared to somebody who lived their whole life there, but at least it was off and on my whole life. And so they're interested in that, but they're clearly growing up Americans, and that's not a bad thing. It's just not what I ever intended.
You did great. So tell me a little bit. Tell me, how did your parents meet?
Yeah, well, my mom was a student, 18 years old. She went over to Norway because a friend was going over. A Norwegian American friend was going over to study for a year and wanted her to come along, and she doesn't have any Scandinavian connections other than a friend in high school who then went in college. So they studied together for a year, and by the time that year was over, they were together. And so my dad followed her back to the Pacific Northwest to get his BA out here, and then they got married while they were in college, and I was born before they graduated. So that's that story, yeah.
So you talked about this earlier because you talked a little bit about the dwelling being the first one made probably in Beirut. But can you tell me a little bit about some of the traditions that your family maintained? Some of these cultural things that you guys did that you really remember.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was food. Of course, my mother, being born in the 60s, gender roles were still a little bit more traditional in my family, and so my mother did the majority of the cooking, but my dad would cook, especially to make food that she didn't make. There's some more Norwegian and Sámi food. Fishing was a big part of that. She was vegetarian, but so anytime there was fish or meat cooked, it was he was the one cooking it. And then we actually spent time every year with our family there. Sometimes just for Christmas, so for a week or two, and sometimes 6 weeks or 2 months in the summer, so for a little bit longer. So yeah, we did a lot of camping, a lot of cross-country skiing. How could I forget that? I was on skis before I was 2 years old, and when we were living in Michigan, my brother and I were the only people we knew who were in our community that we knew who were competing in cross-country skiing, going to ski meets and racing. And I did okay. My brother was winning all kinds of medals, and he was young. He's 3 years younger than me, but he was clearly the more athletically gifted one of the two of us. But so there was, so those sorts of things, food. But I was also a real. So my dad grew up like many Sámi people in a religiously conservative family, and he was, and to a certain extent still is, a conservative Christian. But weirdly, in the Midwest of the United States, he was a conservative Christian who was a socialist, which you didn't get that combination much in the U.S. And that, I think, is clearly to his upbringing in northern Norway in the mid-20th century, where among poor Sámi farming families and working-class families, it was easy to be conservative Christian and socialist at the same time. So that, and his sort of disdain for titles and pompousness is really a part of certainly of Norwegian culture, but even more so of Sámi culture. And so those are things I inherited, sort of a critical view from him of I remember him telling me we moved to Michigan, and I was in second grade, and the teacher was reading us a book about it was a novel for kids, but it was illustrating some of the sort of McCarthyist views of the horrors of the Soviet Union, and I was telling him about it, and he goes, and he was just helping me to deconstruct that as a second grader, and said, but in the Soviet Union, they tell you they make you think things, and he said, nobody can make you think anything. Well, they try to get you to think things. Oh, what, by reading books to you about how evil the other country is? I'm like, oh, I was like, things started to click into place there. So that's, is that a universal Sámi thing or Norwegian thing? No, but it certainly comes from his positionality in that, and it was passed on to me. And so the whole time growing up, I think I've been a bit of a cynic and a skeptic, and that comes from my dad's cynicism, or not cynicism so much as skepticism with where he found himself and the things that he found himself surrounded by living in the Midwest. Yeah.
And if you could, you touched on a lot of these. We're just, it maybe if you could, in a sentence or two, could you tell me just maybe like a list of some of the things, these things that you carried over into your adult life?
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely, and this is something I've tried to share with my kids too. Definitely getting out in the world around us, outdoors. Like I tell them, I said we don't live off of fishing, and I don't hunt. That's not an ethical thing so much as a practical thing. I didn't grow up here. I don't have the time to get the training to become a hunter here. I don't have a good friend who can take me along and show me how to do it. So don't hunt, but I fish, and we're not living off of that, I tell the kids, but I said it's important for us to be connected to this place, to get some of our food from this place, and go out and pick some blueberries in the fall, wild ones, and go out and get fish, eat some fish that we've caught every month or so, just to sort of, but then so we do a lot of camping, and until I injured my foot, I was just this spring break supposed to go backpacking with my 16-year-old, but now I'm limping around on a cane, so we did car camping instead. But that's certainly one. So the outdoors and respect for it, it's a little bit different from the common backpacking ethic, though, because we don't really have the idea of leave no trace, because that seems strange, because we've been here, and that's something I've noticed. Very much a Sámi attitude is not to leave no trace. It's just don't destroy the place. You can certainly leave a trace because you've been there. It'd be weird if, are you trying to sneak around? It's like thieves are the ones that come into your house and don't leave a trace. Visitors leave a trace. So so that's one of them. Skepticism towards authority is something that I've kept all my life. Ironically enough, I was skeptical towards my dad's authority too, but that's just what he got for raising me that way, And so I think my kids have really picked up on that too. My oldest has moved away from home now, but he lives in Tacoma too, and he's always tweeting me things where he's just ridiculing something that's going on, and then anything I say, he'll like, oh, but have you thought about this, and start to critique that too. So that's been passed on. Food, I haven't been quite as good, mostly because there's so many other good cuisines. I love Nordic food, it's a Scandinavian food, a Sámi food, but there's so many other good things out there too. So we like a lot of Thai, we like sushi, we like Mexican food, we like all sorts of things. And so I haven't really kept them, but they at least are familiar with, like we go up to IKEA regularly just for the things that the food that we can't get anywhere else. So we always have several tubes of the caviar in the fridge and things like that. But those are I think the more important things are really the things that come from being situated as an Indigenous person, make me aware very, very much about Indigenous issues, land sovereignty issues, issues of settler colonialism, and I've tried to keep my kids very much aware of those too, and they are, even though they don't really have the experience of growing up in a Sámi community or Sámi cultural context. They're certainly aware of noticing. I can remember my son went. He actually, my youngest, did his first grade that year that we were on sabbatical in Norway, and they don't have kindergarten there, so that's the year he would have been in kindergarten here. So he came back and repeated first grade here, and come October, there was like Columbus Day. And he says, why is there a Columbus Day? Asks my first grader. And he's like, that's the worst thing in the world. And I'm like, okay. So they've gotten some of those. They've gotten some of those values. I think the value of family being important is kind of hypocritical. I mean, they certainly feel like our nuclear family is important, but we've had so little contact with some of their grandparents during their childhood because they live in so far away that it's hard to. And we haven't traveled nearly as much as my parents did when I was a kid. So they don't have this experience of going to Norway every year, or even going out to the Midwest for some grandparents there every year. So they've got a grandmother out in the Pacific Northwest, my mother's out here, and my wife's father is out in Washington also. So they've had two grandparents nearby, but there's two that are far away. And well, actually 4 that are far away, because the others 2 have both remarried, and so they've got 6 grandparents, but only 2 that they see often.
So let's go ahead and start with openness. When you think of openness, how does that resonate with you in your life? What is openness, and how does it resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think openness is really important, and there are times when for work and stuff, I'm told like this is confidential, you can't share this, and it's always. I get usually it's for a reason that's a valid reason, but it always just feels difficult. It's like, well, why would we be keeping this secret? Why don't we tell somebody about this? So I think openness, transparency is always important. When people are doing things, since I work in higher education, so I try to tell my students what's going on, not just on campus, not just with why are we doing, here's why this is happening in this class. Here's some of the issues that are happening on campus that you might want to be aware of, but also within my field, or when I teach, I've been a proponent of this since I was a grad student. So we teach the controversies. I don't try to tell my students that there is a unanimous consensus on what is truth in our fields. There isn't. Those are highly debated, and I try to point that out. And I say, you're probably going to take classes from professors who have this opinion, and here's why I have this opinion. And then there are 3 or 4 other opinions that maybe nobody in our campus really espouses, but they're out there, and you're going to, and these are, try to explain what some of the differences are. Always try to say where I'm coming from so that I give context to my own opinions and don't present them just sort of as the authoritative and only truth, but this is like, from my position, this is how I see things, and some people from other positions see them this way, and here are some of the arguments we have. I think in a society, openness is important too. We have to know what, for example, in government, what the people we're electing are doing and why, and we have to know, the people who control our commerce, what are they doing and why. I think so. I guess it helps that before I went to grad school, I worked as a journalist for a while, so I was very much about finding out what was going on and getting the word out there. So back when there were still jobs in newspapers, yeah.
Let's move to sustainability. Talk to me about sustainability. What is sustainability as a Nordic value, and why is it important?
Well, it's interesting, sustainability as a Nordic value. I want to circle back to that. I mean, why is it important? We've got this planet, and it's finite, and if we use up what we need or we destroy what we need, it's not going to be there. So from a very self-serving, you don't have to be an altruist. It's just like for ourselves as a species, for ourselves as people, we need to be sustainable. If you value, like I do, other beings for their own merit and not just for what they can do for me, but see yourself as part of a community with people, including non-human people, and with place as place as something with a personality, then it becomes the only ethical way to live in terms of relating to others. I think sustainability, though, also has to involve, like sustainability in the workplace means not overworking people. People need to work at a level that is sustainable, that they can come back to work every day for years and not have burnt out or have gotten ulcers or heart attacks or whatever, So it's more than just a carbon footprint, although carbon footprint's important, but it's a whole list of things. As to the degree that it's a Nordic value, sometimes that's more in lip service than reality, I think, because there's all kinds of mining and logging and all sorts of destructive, extractive things happening in the Nordic region, and have been, but it's increasing now, and it's certainly an issue for Sámi folks, especially reindeer herders, but also for Sea Sámi fishing communities, with the kind of, and some of it then is ironically and cynically connected to the green economy. So expanding lots of copper mines to get copper for batteries for electric cars, which is so highly destructive, or seizing and destroying traditional winter grazing lands to create wind turbine farms and putting reindeer herding families out of business, leading to a high suicide rate among young reindeer herding men in South Sámi areas. Of my Sámi friends, I can't even count now how many of my friends of people my age that I've known since I was a young adult who've had suicides in their immediate family because of that. It's a widespread thing, and that's in the name of sustainability, but it's clearly not sustainable. So I think it does get voiced a lot as a value in the Nordic region, and I would say Nordic economies are a little more sustainable and green than the U.S. economy, but it's also something that's easy to pay lip service to, whether you're actually upholding it or not. So there's certainly a lot of the whole policy in Norway on the Norwegian side is to turn the north into to develop the north of Norway. And by develop, they mean let's harvest all those resources that are, let's mine everything, let's drill for new oil and all these things that really aren't sustainable. And not only are they not sustainable, they're intruding, they're acts of colonization too. So that's a really big issue for me. I guess I should mention I teach in our interdisciplinary environmental studies program too, so including a course on environmental justice and Indigenous peoples. So
what does social justice mean to you, and what does it mean sort of in the look of it being a Nordic value?
I mean, social justice is, there's so many, we take all day just to even catalog all the different sort of subcategories of social justice. But I mean, at its core, it's about valuing all human beings and all human societies, and not only valuing them, but creating systems within which they can all thrive, and people can whether it has to do with economic differences, with religious differences, with ethnic differences, with linguistic, differences, with racialization, with sexuality, gender. All of these things are social justice. And so the overarching theme is that a just society allows everybody to live in the way that is who they are without being devalued for that. But that's so generic that it doesn't, to say it like that doesn't really help us with anything. So I think it's been valued for a long time in the Nordic areas. We certainly see already the social democratic changes of the early 20th century were moves towards social justice from a labor perspective. The fact that the Nordic, Finland was the first large area to grant women the vote, and Norway was the first independent country to grant women the vote. I mean, so social justice when it comes to gender was a big issue in Scandinavia early on compared to some places. I mean, early, it's only the 20th century. We've had lots of centuries before then, but still it's been important for a long time, and that's why we see on many sort of global benchmarks or evaluations of where women are closest to equality. It's usually in Nordic states, but still aren't at gender equality. But there's work being done towards that. I think also starting in the late 20th century and moving well into this century, the Nordic countries have become really open and supportive of LGBTQ issues too. So it's but again, they're not the only places in the world that's done that. It's happened even here. So although people are trying to roll it back now too. So, but all of those things were contested, and continue to be contested in Norway. So it's not, or not just Norway, in the Nordic region. So it's not as if they're universal Nordic values. Women didn't get the right to vote or the right to own property or the right to something approaching pay equity without lots of people opposing that and fighting that. Didn't get the right to reproductive choice without people fighting that. LGBTQ equality, which hasn't been fully reached, but certainly the efforts to move in that direction have always been protested and fought. We see then where I think the Nordic countries have done worse, though, than in gender and then certainly in most of the 20th century they were working towards economic, class, social justice in terms of class-based issues, class conflict and economic exploitation. And they made a lot of progress, but that's been rolling back since the end of the 20th century. We're not back to where we were in 1900, but I think some things were better in the late 80s, early 90s than they are now in terms of that. But in the mid-20th century, the Nordic countries were very critical of racism in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, settler colonialism in Palestine. Very outspokenly critical of those things, and to the point of almost cutting off diplomatic relations with South Africa and having a lot of tensions in those sorts of areas, and speaking up loudly about Jim Crow in the mid-20th century in the U.S. and things like that. But while being completely ignoring what was going on with the Sámi in the Nordic regions, while carrying out forced sterilizations of Roma and Romani women. But there didn't seem to be a lot of ethnic or racial tension because the majority societies were so much the majority. There were so few people in other ethnic groups. And so with migration of people from other parts of the world and more noticeable ethnic minorities and racialized minorities, we've seen in the Nordic region that it's full of problems in these areas like everywhere else. It's not an innocent place compared to everywhere else. I wouldn't say it's worse than everywhere else either, but it's just not as different from the rest of the world as it once thought it was. And so I think those are areas. That's certainly an area where work needs to be done. Also, I'm trying to vilify the Nordic region. It's not perfect. It's not qualitatively different from the rest of the world. And so there's work to do there, very much in terms of designing and building a society where there's room for ethnic difference, linguistic difference, racial difference, religious difference, all of those things. So I think they are values shared by many Nordic people, and there are lots of Nordic people working very hard for very different aspects of social justice, but they're always also opposed by large numbers of Nordic people too. It's a contested value.
So let's talk about innovation as a Nordic value, and what is innovation, and how does it resonate with you?
Yeah, I think innovation is the one that I might have less to say about. The others are all in areas that I write about and teach about. Innovation is thinking of new ways to do things, and there has been a lot of innovation in Nordic societies, both social innovation but technological innovation. I think the flip side to that, though, is not throwing out good things that aren't innovative, that are traditional but that work. So that I think there needs to be a balance, that we don't just have change for the sake of change, but change when it's needed. I think one of the things that I've noticed a lot with people from a number of different Nordic national and ethnic backgrounds is a willingness to try something new, a willingness but we also see sometimes we see the willingness to try something new in the Nordic region because it's being done everywhere else or some other places, and there may not be a reason to do it in the Nordic region too. When the funding for education was being reduced drastically in the first decade of this century on the Norwegian side. They said that's what they're doing everywhere else, and everywhere else was suffering economically, and Norway wasn't, but they were doing it too, just because it was what was happening. So those sorts of things, it was like, do we need change just because it's for change, or is there a reason to change something? But I think clearly when it comes to design. Scandinavian design has been innovative for a long time, and it really marked itself in the 20th century as being, there were a few, like the Bauhaus in Germany was also innovative and different, but I love the fact that in those examples, it was something that was new and was also beautiful. It was functional, but it was also beautiful. It was it's a good kind of innovation, not just destroying something, but making something that serves. I think this gets back to the social democracy, social democratic ideals behind Scandinavian modern. Is that we need to make something that's cheap and functional and beautiful for people, so that everybody can have something of quality in their household. And I love that. That's great. So yeah, I like it. Overall, I'm always a little bit careful about. We don't want to get caught up with innovation as the new catchword and just do change just because it's trendy to do change. We do change when there's a reason for it, but we shouldn't hold on to things just because they've always been done that way if there's clear reasons to change them either. So.